I was just about to hand over a bag of my juiciest, ripest tomatoes when I heard it, the unmistakable screech of an entitled voice cutting through the calm morning air. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" I turned around, already knowing who it was. Karen, the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer of all things proper. She stood there on the sidewalk, arms crossed so tightly it looked like she was holding herself together with sheer force of will. Her platinum blonde bob was frozen in place with hairspray, and her designer sunglasses rested on top of her head like a crown of superiority. I forced a smile, trying to stay polite. "Morning, Karen. Just selling some produce to my neighbors." Karen scoffed, taking a step forward like she was gearing up for an interrogation. "Selling? You mean ruining the whole vibe of the neighborhood with this?" She waved her hand dramatically toward my modest little stand, the tacky farm store setup. A few of my regulars, Mrs. Thompson and Old Man Jenkins, exchanged looks that clearly said they'd seen this show before. They were just as entertained as they were annoyed. I sighed. "It's just a produce stand, Karen. People like fresh fruits and veggies." Her face contorted in disgust, like I'd just handed her a rotten potato. "This is a residential area, not some backward farmer's market. Do you even have a permit for this?" I laughed. "A permit? Karen, I'm literally selling a few tomatoes and cucumbers from my backyard garden. It's not like I'm running a full-fledged grocery store." She gasped, looking around like she was hunting for an audience. "So you admit it. You're running an illegal business." I knew it. At that point, even Jenkins let out a wheezing laugh. "Oh, come on, Karen. He's got the best cucumbers in town. Why don't you just buy some and chill?" Karen's face turned bright red. "I would never buy vegetables from some amateur. Do you even know if your produce is safe? You could be poisoning people, for all we know." I raised an eyebrow. "Pretty sure no one's ever died from an organic carrot, Karen." That's when she pulled out her phone. "I'm reporting this. Right now. This is unacceptable. Our neighborhood has standards." With a dramatic gesture, she tapped her screen and started going off into the receiver. The whole street went quiet, everyone watching as she seethed, probably reporting me to whichever poor city worker had to pick up the call. I couldn't hear exactly what she was saying, but words like illegal operation, health hazard, and ruining the neighborhood's reputation floated in the air. I crossed my arms, shaking my head, as Mrs. Thompson leaned over and whispered, "She once tried to report my garden gnome for being an unauthorized decoration." By the time Karen hung up, she was grinning, looking smug and triumphant. "Enjoy it while you can," she said with a smirk, "because soon, your little peasant market is going to be shut down for good." And with that, she spun around and stormed off, probably expecting everyone to join her cause. Instead, all I got were chuckles and murmurs of support. "Don't let her get to you, Jake," Jenkins said, shaking his head. "She's been like that for years. The HOA won't even listen to her anymore." I smiled, though part of me couldn't help but wonder, was Karen just an annoyance, or was she about to become a much bigger issue than I had expected? The next morning, I got my answer. A city inspector showed up at my door, clipboard in hand. "Sir, we received a complaint about an unauthorized business operation on this property." I exhaled, shaking my head. "Let me guess, blonde lady about this tall? Looks like she leads a cult for angry suburban moms." The inspector cleared his throat, trying to hide a grin. "We can't disclose complainants, but let's just say you're not the first person on this street to get a visit because of certain individuals." I led him to my stand, explaining that I was just selling some extra produce from my backyard. No big operation, no employees, no health risks, just good old-fashioned homegrown food. He checked everything out, jotted down some notes, then nodded. "Looks fine to me. As long as you're not violating any zoning laws, you're good." I let out a breath of relief, but I should have known Karen wouldn't let it slide that easily. Less than 20 minutes later, she showed up again, standing at the edge of my property with a smug look on her face. "Well," she demanded, "did they shut you down?" The inspector turned to her, looking unimpressed. "This stand is not violating any ordinances. He's within his rights to sell homegrown produce." Karen's mouth dropped open. "That's ridiculous. He's running a business in a residential zone. You need to do something about this." The inspector sighed, clearly fed up with whatever personal agenda she had. "Unless you can provide legal evidence that he's in violation, there's nothing more to discuss." Karen sputtered, clearly stunned that she wasn't getting her way. "All right, I'll take this higher up." You'll see. The inspector gave me a weary nod before walking off, leaving Karen fuming on the sidewalk. I couldn't help but smirk. Well, Karen, looks like you're going to have to put up with my tacky farm stand a little longer. She stormed off, but there was something in the way she left that made me feel uneasy. This wasn't over. And I was right. Over the next few days, she stepped up her campaign against me. Flyers showed up on doorsteps claiming my produce was dangerously unregulated. Rumors spread that I was using toxic pesticides. One morning, I even found a fake online review from someone saying they got sick from my tomatoes, despite the fact that I had never sold anything online. But for every lie Karen spread, my neighbors showed more support. Mrs. Thompson made it a point to buy twice as many vegetables as usual. Jenkins camped out at my stand like a bouncer, giving Karen the stink eye whenever she passed by. Then came the final straw, when Karen really crossed the line. She called in a fake health hazard complaint, not just to the city, but to the health department. One morning, I woke up to find a guy in a suit waiting in my yard, clipboard in hand. We received a report that you may be selling unsanitary produce. I groaned, rubbing my temples. Let me guess, blonde lady, talks like she owns the neighborhood. The man sighed. We've heard about her. He inspected my stand, took samples, even checked out my garden. In the end, he said, I see no violations. Everything here is clean, properly stored, and safe. Karen, who had been watching from her front porch, stomped over. That's impossible. He's selling rotten vegetables. The inspector shook his head. Everything here is fine. If you keep filing false reports, you could face consequences. Karen's face drained of color. False. But I was just concerned for public safety. The inspector ignored her, handing me a report that confirmed I was in the clear. Karen glared at me, her fists clenched. You haven't seen the last of me. I smirked. Oh, I'm counting on it. As she stormed off, I had a feeling she was about to take things up a notch, and I was ready for whatever she had planned. The police showed up at Karen's house. I watched from my porch as 2 officers knocked, and Karen greeted them with her usual fake smile, until she saw me standing across the street, phone in hand. It didn't take long before her voice started getting louder. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught a few choice phrases. That video is doctored. He's framing me. This is a conspiracy. The officers didn't look convinced. After a few more minutes, one of them handed her a piece of paper. Karen's face went ashen. Then, without saying another word, she slammed the door shut. The neighborhood chat lit up. Someone had gotten a better look at the paper. A vandalism citation, a fine, and a very clear warning that if she kept up this behavior, she could face serious charges. For the first time since this whole thing started, Karen had actually lost. And that was just the beginning. Because the neighborhood had had enough. That night, a new plan was put into motion, one that would show Karen once and for all that she had messed with the wrong community. The next morning, the signs went up. Boycott Karen's business. Support local farmers. And just like that, the tables had flipped. Karen had spent weeks trying to ruin my livelihood. Now, the whole neighborhood was about to ruin hers. The next few days were strangely quiet. Too quiet. Karen hadn't shown her face since the health inspector shut her down, and that alone made me uneasy. It wasn't like her to back down so easily. If there was one thing I knew about Karen, it was that she didn't take defeat lightly. She waited. She schemed. She found another way to make my life miserable. And just when I thought maybe, just maybe, she had finally let it go, the rumors started. It began slowly. A few customers seemed hesitant when they came by my stand, their faces uneasy. I'd hand them a bag of tomatoes, and they'd frown, inspecting them more closely than usual. Then one afternoon, Mrs. Patel, a longtime customer, approached my stand and whispered, Jake, I have to ask, are you really using pesticides banned in the U.S.? I almost laughed, but then I saw the seriousness in her face. What? No. Where did you hear that? She looked around as if she didn't want anyone to hear. Karen's been talking. She's telling people you spray your crops with dangerous chemicals, that your vegetables are making people sick. I let out a sharp breath, gripping the edge of my stand. I knew she wouldn't drop it. That's a complete lie. Everything I grow is organic. You know that. Mrs. Patel nodded, but I could see the doubt still lingering in her eyes. Lies like that had a way of sticking, of getting under people's skin. Even those who wanted to believe me were starting to second-guess things. That same afternoon, I found a stack of flyers shoved under my door. The paper was bright red, practically screaming for attention. At the top, in huge, bold letters, it said, "Warning, unsafe produce being sold in our neighborhood." Below it was a list of supposed violations my stand had committed, none of which were true. Selling contaminated produce, using illegal pesticides, operating without inspection. At the bottom, a final warning: protect your family. Do not buy from unlicensed produce stands. My blood boiled as I crumpled the flyer in my hand. Karen wasn't just trying to get under my skin anymore. She was actively trying to ruin my reputation. If enough people believed her, my stand would be done. The next morning, I decided to take the initiative and beat her to the punch. I set up a small sign at my stand: 100% organic, zero pesticides, ask me anything. I wanted my customers to see with their own eyes that I had nothing to hide. I even offered to show them my gardening process. Some people laughed at the sheer absurdity of Karen's claims. Others, though, looked a bit uncertain. The damage was being done. Then came the health inspector. Again, I had been expecting it. Another anonymous complaint. Another forced inspection. This time, the guy seemed even more frustrated than last time. "I don't suppose you can guess who sent us," he said, pulling out his clipboard. I sighed. "Blonde, stiff posture. Thinks she runs the world." The inspector smirked. "Bingo." He checked everything again. My stand, my produce, my storage. He even examined the soil in my garden. When he was done, he gave me a frustrated look. "I'll be filing another report saying there's nothing wrong here. But between you and me, if this keeps up, we might start looking into filing harassment charges against her." That was the only bright spot. Maybe Karen was digging her own grave. But she wasn't finished. 2 days later, I woke up to find my stand vandalized. The wooden frame had been kicked over, vegetables smashed, and scattered across my yard. My sign was gone. In its place, someone had spray-painted poison in red. I stood there, staring at the mess, my fists clenched. I already knew who did it. There was no proof, of course, but I didn't need any. Karen was escalating, and I wasn't about to sit back and let her win. I cleaned up the mess, fixed my stand, and made a call. By the afternoon, a few neighbors had gathered at my house. They'd all heard what happened, and they were furious. "This is ridiculous," Mrs. Thompson said, shaking her head. "She's gone too far." Jenkins grumbled, arms crossed. "You know, I think it's about time we send her a message." I looked at them, surprised. "You mean?" Mrs. Thompson smiled, a glint in her eye. "We support you, Jake, and we're going to prove it." That weekend, my stand saw more customers than ever. Not just my regulars, but new faces. Neighbors who hadn't bought from me before, but had heard about what was going on. They came in droves, buying every last vegetable I had. Some even handed me extra cash, telling me to keep growing, no matter what that woman says. Karen watched from across the street, her face twisted in a storm of rage and disbelief. She'd expected people to turn on me. Instead, they were rallying behind me. But she still had one last move to make. I found out about it the next morning when a cop knocked on my door. "Sir, we received a report about your stand blocking public property." I ran a hand through my hair, letting out a tired laugh. "Let me guess. Blonde. Angry. Talks like she's royalty." The officer's mouth twitched slightly. "I can't disclose the complainant, but let's just say you're not the first person in this neighborhood to deal with this." He checked the placement of my stand. It was well within my property line, not blocking the sidewalk or street. After a few minutes, he sighed and shook his head. "You're fine." This was clearly a nuisance report. I glanced across the street. Karen was watching from her window, waiting. When she saw the officer leave without shutting me down, she slammed the blinds so hard I could hear it. But I wasn't done yet. I turned to my neighbors, who had gathered to watch the latest episode in the Karen saga. "She wants a fight? Fine. Let's give her one." Jenkins cracked his knuckles. "What are you thinking?" I grinned. "A neighborhood-wide support local farmers day. Let's make sure everyone knows exactly who they should be buying from." And just like that, the idea took off. By the next morning, signs were going up all over the neighborhood. People were posting online about my produce stand, sharing photos and glowing reviews. Karen's plan had backfired spectacularly. Instead of ruining me, she had made me the most popular vendor in town. I could only imagine how furious she was. But if I thought she would back down now, I was wrong. Karen wasn't done. She was just getting started. Karen had been silent for 2 full days, and that alone told me she was plotting something big. The last time she went quiet, I woke up to find my produce stand destroyed. Now, after her failed attempts to bring me down with lies and fake complaints, she was probably stewing, trying to find a new way to ruin me. And, as expected, when she finally made her move, she went all in. It all started early one morning, just as I was getting my stand ready. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like things were finally calming down. My neighbors had shown they were on my side. The police and city inspectors had shut down Karen's absurd claims. My little produce stand was thriving despite everything she'd tried. I was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had finally given up. Then the police showed up. 2 squad cars pulled up to my driveway, lights flashing, but sirens off. A few neighbors peeked out from their windows. Some stepped out onto their porches to see what was going on. My heart raced, not because I had done anything wrong, but because I already knew who was behind this. An officer stepped out, his face unreadable as he approached. "Are you Jake Simmons?" I wiped my hands on my apron and nodded. "Yeah, that's me. We received a report of an illegal business operation, health code violations, and unlicensed sales of food items." I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. "Let me guess. Blonde woman, lives across the street, thinks she's the queen of the neighborhood." The officer's lips twitched like he was holding back a smirk. "We can't disclose the complainant." I crossed my arms. "You don't have to. I already know." The officer sighed and flipped open his notepad. "Mind if we take a look?" I gestured toward my stand. "Go ahead. Take all the time you need." And they did. For the next 20 minutes, 2 officers and a city official examined every single part of my setup. They checked my produce, my storage, my permits. One of them even made a call to confirm that I wasn't breaking any regulations. When they were done, the lead officer walked over to me with a tired look. "Everything's in order," he said. "No violations, no illegal activity. We'll be filing this as a false report." I exhaled, half relieved, half frustrated. "And what happens to the person who keeps wasting your time with these complaints?" The officer hesitated, then lowered his voice. "If this keeps happening, she might face consequences for filing repeated false reports." That was the only good news I had gotten all morning. Karen, of course, was watching the whole thing from her front porch. The moment the officers left, she stormed over, her face twisted in anger. "This is outrageous," she shrieked, jabbing a perfectly manicured finger toward my stand. "You mean to tell me he's getting away with this? You're just going to let him break the law?" One of the officers turned to her, looking less than amused. "There's no law being broken. He's operating within regulations." Karen let out an angry laugh. "That's impossible. Look at this. He's running a business in a residential area. He's selling unsafe food. He's bringing down property values." The officer sighed. "If you continue to file false complaints, you could face legal consequences." Karen's face turned bright red. "This is harassment. I'm being targeted for standing up for the integrity of our neighborhood." The officer exchanged a look with his partner before shaking his head. "Have a nice day." Then they got in their squad cars and drove off, leaving Karen seething on the sidewalk. For a moment, she just stood there, fuming, her hands clenched into fists. Then, without warning, she turned to me. "This isn't over," she hissed. And then she walked away. That night, I installed security cameras. It turned out to be the smartest thing I'd done since starting my stand. Because the next morning, I woke up to find my produce stand completely destroyed. Wooden planks scattered across my yard. Vegetables stomped into the dirt. My sign ripped in half and thrown into the bushes. It was worse than last time. Whoever had done it made sure there was nothing left to salvage. And of course, I already knew who was responsible. I pulled up the footage on my phone, and sure enough, there she was. Karen. The video showed her creeping out of her house in the middle of the night, her bathrobe billowing behind her like some sort of villainous cape. She marched across my yard, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. Then, one by one, she kicked over my crates, stomped on my produce, and ripped apart my stand with a level of fury I hadn't seen before. By the time she was finished, Karen was panting, hands on her hips, surveying the damage like she had just won some kind of battle. I couldn't help but smile. Because this time, I had the proof. By noon, the video was everywhere. I posted it in the neighborhood group chat, and it spread like wildfire. Within minutes, the comments started flooding in. "Unbelievable. She's gone too far. This woman is insane. I knew she was petty, but this is criminal." Even those who had stayed out of it before were now picking a side. Nobody liked Karen, but up until now, most people had just ignored her antics. Now, after seeing her in action, they were furious. And then came the best part. The police showed up at Karen's house. I watched from my porch as 2 officers knocked, and Karen answered with her usual fake smile. But when she saw me standing across the street with my phone in hand, her face dropped. It didn't take long before her voice started rising. I couldn't catch every word, but I overheard a few choice phrases. That video is doctored. He's framing me. This is a conspiracy. The officers weren't buying it. After a few more minutes, one of them handed her a piece of paper. Karen's face went white. Without saying another word, she slammed the door in their faces. The neighborhood chat went wild. Someone had gotten a closer look at the paper. A vandalism citation, a fine, and a very clear warning that if she didn't stop her behavior, she could face serious charges. For the first time since this whole battle started, Karen had actually lost. And it was just the beginning. The neighborhood had had enough. That night, a new plan was set in motion, one that would show Karen, once and for all, that she had messed with the wrong community. The next morning, the signs went up. Boycott Karen's business. Support local farmers. And just like that, the tables had turned. Karen had spent weeks trying to ruin my livelihood. Now, the whole neighborhood was about to ruin hers. The morning after the video of Karen destroying my stand went viral in the neighborhood chat, something incredible happened. People started showing up. Not just my regular customers, but neighbors I had never even spoken to before. They walked past my stand, nodded at me, and then walked right past Karen's boutique without even looking at it. Some even crossed the street to avoid stepping foot near her store. At first, Karen didn't notice. She stood behind the counter of her overpriced boutique, sipping her coffee like she was still the queen of the street. But as the hours ticked by and not a single customer walked through her door, I could see the irritation growing on her face. She stepped outside more than once, adjusting the display in the window, smoothing her hair, glancing around as if trying to figure out why the usual crowd wasn't coming in. By the afternoon, it was undeniable. Her store was empty. The parking spots in front of it, which were usually taken up by a few well-to-do housewives looking for overpriced candles, were now vacant. And that was just the beginning. The real blow came when the neighborhood chat exploded with posts about the boycott. I don't know about you guys, but I won't be spending a dime at Karen's shop ever again. She tried to ruin a hard-working neighbor's business. Let's see how she likes it when the tables turn. Time to support local farmers and good people. Sorry, Karen, but you brought this on yourself. Screenshots of the video were shared all over, with people commenting things like, "Wow, she really went that far. And this is next-level petty." The message was clear. Karen had burned every bridge she had, and now she was about to experience what it felt like to be on the receiving end. By the time I closed up my stand for the day, Karen was pacing outside her store, phone pressed to her ear, looking absolutely livid. She kept throwing glances at me across the street, but for once, she didn't march over to yell at me. I knew why. She was panicking, and she had every reason to. The next morning, the real damage started to show. I saw it the moment I stepped outside. Her store's front window, usually spotless, was smudged all over, like she had been. Pressing her face against the glass, waiting for customers who never came. A few of her usual regulars had probably gotten the message and decided to take their business elsewhere. Then came the real kicker. A delivery truck pulled up in front of her store. The driver stepped out, clipboard in hand, and knocked on her door. Karen rushed out, looking frazzled, her fake smile plastered on her face. I could hear their conversation even from where I stood. These orders were placed for restocking, but, well, there's an issue. Karen frowned, arms crossed. What issue? The driver flipped through his clipboard. 3 of your suppliers are pulling their contracts. They said there's been a sudden downturn in demand. Karen's mouth dropped open. What? That's ridiculous. My business has been fine. The driver hesitated before clearing his throat. I don't know what to tell you. All I know is they don't want to send more inventory if it's not selling. Karen sputtered, hands flailing. No, this is a mistake. I need those shipments. I have high-end customers. The driver gave her a polite but unimpressed shrug before handing her a notice. You might want to call them directly, but from what I understand, they're cutting ties. I watched as Karen grabbed the paper from his hand, glaring at it like it had personally insulted her. The truck pulled away, leaving her standing there, clutching the notice so tightly her hands shook. She turned toward my stand, her face twisted in fury. I braced myself, expecting her to storm over and start screeching about how this was all my fault. But instead, she did something far more desperate. She went back inside her shop, grabbed a big sign, and dragged it outside. Sale, everything 50% off. The bold letters practically screamed desperation. She propped it up, then stepped back, hands on her hips, waiting for the customers to flood in. They didn't. A few people slowed down when they passed, but instead of walking in, they glanced at the sale sign, then at me, and kept walking. Karen's face turned redder with each passing second. By noon, she was out again, flipping the sign around. Sale, everything 70% off. She stood there, watching, waiting. Still nothing. She stormed back inside. Half an hour later, a new sign appeared in the window. Final clearance, prices slashed. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But then I remembered all the time she had called the cops on me, every false report, every attempt to destroy what I had worked for. And I thought, no, this is exactly what she deserves. That evening, as I was packing up my stand, Karen finally lost it. She stormed out of her shop and marched across the street, stopping just inches from my produce stand. This is your fault, she spat, pointing a trembling finger at me. You and your stupid vegetables ruined my business. I looked at her, then at the completely empty store behind her. Karen, I didn't tell anyone to boycott you. People just don't want to support someone who ruins other people's livelihoods. She let out an angry, almost frantic laugh. Oh, please, don't act like you're innocent. You manipulated them. You made them turn against me. I shook my head. Karen, you did that all on your own. She screamed in frustration, then stomped back across the street. The next morning, a new sign appeared in her shop window. Store closing, final days. Word spread quickly. The boutique was officially going out of business. I heard bits and pieces from my neighbors. Apparently, Karen had taken a huge financial hit from the boycott. Without regular customers, she couldn't pay her rent. Without suppliers, she couldn't restock. It was only a matter of time before she had no choice but to shut down. On the final day, I watched as she packed up the last of her inventory, shoving it into boxes with the same anger and bitterness she had carried from the beginning. She slammed the door shut, locked it, and for the first time since moving into the neighborhood, she was quiet. Then, without a word to anyone, she loaded up her car and drove off. The neighborhood group chat was filled with celebratory messages. She's finally gone. Good riddance. Maybe now we can have some peace. And as I stood at my produce stand, serving a line of happy customers, I realized that I had won. Not just against Karen, but for the entire neighborhood. Justice had been served, and the community had come together stronger than ever. Karen had lost, and we had all won. A strange calm settled over the neighborhood after Karen left. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could open my produce stand without worrying about false reports, sabotage, or ridiculous accusations. There were no health inspectors knocking on my door, no police showing up for fake complaints, and best of all, no screeching voice shouting about property values and zoning laws. It was almost too good to be true. The first morning after Karen's departure, I stood by my stand, half expecting her to come storming out with some last-ditch attempt to ruin me. But the street was quiet, peaceful. The usual morning customers strolled by with smiles, stopping to chat, grabbing their fresh fruits and vegetables, and laughing about how strange it felt not to have Karen lurking around, watching their every move. Jenkins walked up, tipping his hat at me before reaching for a bag of cucumbers. Gotta admit, Jake, it's weird. I keep looking over at that empty store like she's gonna pop out any second. I chuckled, handing him his change. I know what you mean. Feels like we finally got rid of a bad spirit or something. Mrs. Thompson joined in, carrying a basket full of tomatoes. I heard from someone in the HOA that she had to break her lease early. Landlord wasn't happy, but I guess he figured it was better than dealing with an empty store for months. Jenkins nodded, remembering the way Karen had packed up in a fury, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment as she hastily shoved box after box into her car. Did she say anything to anyone before she left? I asked. Jenkins smirked. Oh, she tried. Posted some long rant in the neighborhood group about how we bullied her and ruined her thriving business. But you should have seen the comments, he added. People weren't having it. Mrs. Thompson laughed. Oh, I saw. Someone replied with the video of her wrecking your stand and said, "Karen, we didn't do this." "You did." I shook my head, still in disbelief at how quickly everything had flipped. For weeks, Karen had been a constant thorn in my side, trying to ruin my small business. Yet, in the end, she had destroyed herself. The neighborhood had come together behind me, not because I asked them to, but because they saw who Karen really was. And the support didn't stop there. A few days after Karen left, a woman in a business suit stopped by my stand. She introduced herself as a representative from the local farmers market committee and explained that they had heard about everything that had happened. "We love seeing local businesses thrive, and we were really impressed with how the community stood behind you," she said, handing me a card. "We'd love to offer you a permanent stall at the farmers market downtown." I blinked, taking the card as her words sank in. A stall at the farmers market. That was huge. It meant reaching a bigger audience, selling more produce, expanding beyond my little front yard stand. I don't know what to say," I admitted, still processing everything. She smiled. "Just think about it. No rush. But after everything you've built here, I think you'd fit in perfectly with our vendors." I watched her walk away, my heart pounding with excitement. The farmers market wasn't just a step up. It was a chance to grow my business into something even bigger. That evening, as I sat on my porch looking out at my stand, I thought about everything that had happened over the past few months. What had started as a small side project had turned into a battle of endurance, a test of patience, and an unexpected community movement. Karen had tried to tear me down at every turn, but instead, she had made my stand stronger than ever. The next morning, I made my decision. I picked up the phone, dialed the number on the card, and accepted the offer. A week later, my first day at the farmers market arrived. My stand, once just a simple setup in my front yard, now had a prime spot among other small vendors, buzzing with activity. The moment I set up, familiar faces from the neighborhood started showing up. Mrs. Thompson, Jenkins, the Patel family, even the young couple who had just moved in down the street. They all came by, buying produce and cheering me on. Word spread fast. The support I'd gained in the neighborhood carried over to new customers at the market. People who had never heard of me before started stopping by, curious about the story behind the stand. Some had even read about it online, since the whole Karen ordeal had somehow made its way into a local news blog. It didn't take long before I realized I was selling out faster than ever. The demand had doubled, and I knew it was time to expand. With the profits I made from the surge in support, I invested in a larger garden space. I bought better equipment, hired a couple of local teens to help with harvesting and setting up the stand. What had started as a backyard project had turned into a full-fledged business. Every now and then, as I walked past the old boutique where Karen's shop used to be, I couldn't help but smile. A few months after she left, a new business took over the space. A small cafe, owned by a young couple eager to bring something fresh and welcoming to the neighborhood. The difference was night and day. Where Karen's shop had once been cold, overpriced, and uninviting, this cafe was warm, friendly, and quickly became a favorite local hangout. One day, I stopped in, ordered a coffee, and sat near the window, watching the street outside. Life had moved on. Karen was gone, her store forgotten, and the neighborhood was thriving in her absence. Jenkins walked in, spotted me, and took a seat across from me. "Funny how things work out, huh?" he said. I took a sip of my coffee, nodding. "Yeah, it really is." He chuckled. "So, think Karen's out there somewhere plotting her comeback?" I laughed, shaking my head. "If she is, she's got a long way to go. This place? This community? It's stronger than her." And that was the truth. Karen had tried to tear me down, but in the end, she had only made me stronger. My business was thriving. The neighborhood was happier. And most importantly, I had learned something valuable. When good people come together, even the biggest Karens of the world don't stand a chance. As I finished my coffee and stepped outside, I looked down the street at my old stand, now just a memory of where it all started. I had come a long way, and somehow, I had Karen to thank for it. I smiled to myself, shook my head, and walked back toward the farmer's market, ready for whatever came next.